I could start by asking you about working with human subjects, and the protections that we put in place to protect human subjects. How is that relevant in family science research that deals with families and children?
Oh, goodness. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I think it's very important to consider as family scientists. So from a qualitative perspective, given that qualitative research would have you more likely interacting with members of families, I think there's a lot of different ethical considerations. So one that specifically comes to mind are the issues that arise when you're trying to decide on your unit of analysis. I think that's really key. I've done research, so a lot of my research looks at low-income parenting, and most recently I've studied individual parents. Some of my first research projects look specifically at couples experiences, and that was really interesting because then you have to take into account, what kind of data you're getting when you're interviewing, say, individual parents or individual, partners within the couple. And how you get one kind of data when you're just interviewing individuals, and then how you get another kind of data when you're interviewing dyads. And then what it means especially, so given that all my research has looked at parents who are very poor, so not just living in poverty, but many of them living in very deep poverty. So if they have housing, housing where they're living with 5, 6, 7, 8 people in 500 square foot apartments. I've interviewed many parents in their cars because that's where they're living. I've interviewed parents in my car because they don't even have a vehicle where they're living in shelters. So, that raises very particular issues about not only rapport that you have with your subjects, but, ethical considerations of who's there, who's privy to the interview. Is it even ethical to interview people, say, in your own vehicle? I know I'm veering off to a lot of different topics right now, but these are just all things that have come up when considering, populations for whom they're really, given their particular life circumstances and very constrained life circumstances, there's really no ideal interview context. I know a lot of my colleagues who study middle class and affluent parents, it's relatively easier to, say, travel to see them and then interview them in their home, right, where respondents tend to feel most comfortable. But when you're studying populations, many of whom don't even have homes, or living with people that, it's just not good to have those people be part of the interview context. You're going to get different data, and they're not going to have the same ability to be candid.
Do people have to have their kids with them when you're interviewing them about parenting? Because that would change your answers, and it might affect kids to hear what their parents are saying about the parenting of them. Yeah. Have you seen this in your work?
Yeah, so I was actually just writing about that in the methods section yesterday. I'm working on a revision of an article right now where I talked about my current research looking at parents who experience diaper need. And I interviewed almost exclusively mothers for reasons that I could talk about. That wasn't my intent. I wanted to interview mothers and fathers, but it was very hard to recruit dads. And I think that's a finding in and of itself, that mothers are doing more of the management of diaper need, which for those who might not be familiar is just lack of access to sufficient diapers for infants and toddlers. And in that case, I decided very specifically to do phone interviews, which are also kind of controversial in research circles. I know a lot of my colleagues who will absolutely not do a phone interview. They think it compromises contextual data. The gold standard is you do interviews in person, you pick up, so you're able to pick up on nonverbal cues and things like that. But given, again, I think this gets back to the positionality issue, not only the positionality of the researcher, but the very specific positionality of your respondents. And so given that I wanted to get data from people who were not just limited to where I was geographically, but also people who were living in shelters or living in multi-generational or multi-family households, the phone was a good choice. And because I was talking to parents many of whom there's no way they could have ever afforded childcare, It was either, and to even to ask them to, find a time where they wouldn't have to, and this was before the pandemic, so it's got a whole new resonance now. But I would say when I did that research project, in about 75% of cases, children were present. And I always ask this because I see everything as data. I could tell most of the time because I could hear mothers, feeding babies or even changing their diapers or just attending to children. So I would always get data about, are your children present? How many are there? What are their ages? And yeah, I mean, just, I think it's good to just be upfront about how the context of your data collection method is shaping the data that you can collect. Right. I think there are both pros and cons to having children present. I think obviously the con is that you're not going to have parents' attention in the same way. It can create an additional level of stress, which when thinking about it from a research ethics perspective, can be a risk. Parents who are trying to attend to little ones while, trying to answer your questions. It could also compromise your data because if you're having to, feed with one hand, change a diaper with another, and then try to, think about complex questions like mothering identity, it's a lot and it can be stressful. But I think there's also ways that you can mitigate that. The way I looked at it is, I was capturing mothers' narratives of how they thought about themselves as mothers and their self-efficacy as mothers, really in real time, right? Like, how do you think about diapering and lack of access to diapering as you are literally changing your child's diapers? And so it made, for a lot of the interviews, it created a richness or a depth that I don't think I would have been able to capture if, I had insisted that I interview them in person or that I interview them without their children present, because a lot of I think, most profound stories I got was mothers telling me literally as they were changing their child's diapers, what it means for them to use every diaper, how they keep track of diapers, how, okay, this was diaper number 8. I know I have 7 more left. I don't have money for 3 more days. Now I know I have to make this diaper last 13 hours. So for what I was trying to understand empirically, it was an incredibly, I think, powerful source of data to actually have them changing their child's diapers as they were telling me about it. But also recognizing too that I had to find ways to mitigate that. So like if a mother, for example, needed to take a moment, like it's clear, the child is getting into something or needs something to eat, and just being very upfront with mothers at the beginning of interviews. Anytime you need to stop, we'll stop, and then we can pick back up when it's convenient for you, even if that means ending the phone call. So, really resonates now, right? Some things that my child needs now can be attended to in 30 seconds. Sometimes it takes a little bit more. And so, just being really upfront with moms about that. And I have to say, it was a really important source of generating rapport with my respondents, because when I communicated to them, at the time, my daughter's 5 now, and at the time she was 2 and 3. So just still in diapers at one point. We were going through potty training. So for me to say, especially to women who were otherwise so socially dissimilar, so most of these were women of color, very, very poor, little education. So, in terms of social characteristics, other really than age and parental status, we were about as different as people could be. And so for me to communicate, like I understand, a little bit in my own very white, class privileged, affluent way, kind of those moment to moment needs of being a parent, and that's okay in the interview context. Mm-hmm. But I think, trying to get back to your question, I think that's one of the ways that positionality has shaped how I think about the research, and just telling mothers, I'm a mom too, my daughter's 2, and kind of sharing stories. But I also think that's very much an ethical issue, because one of the risks that our research can present to respondents, of course, is stress. And so, if you have an interview where you're asking respondents to focus exclusively on your questions, but they've got all these other things going on embedded in their lives, I think one of the things we can do to mitigate that risk is to communicate to them that the interview is not the most important thing in their lives, and that we get that. Right. So, and in terms of having children present, or really in this case, other people present, just one, knowing if other people were present in the household and just being mindful of how that shaped what respondents could disclose to you. You know, I just reviewed a book about formerly incarcerated dads and they interviewed dyads. And an entire chapter in this book, based on this large 10-year longitudinal study, was about how the researchers discovered that there was really no way they were going to get fully accurate data about intimate partner violence, especially when they were interviewing members of the couple together. But even when they were interviewing individual partners, the fathers, but especially the mothers, were never going to disclose anything that could potentially send their partners or their children's fathers back to jail. So I think there's no perfect research situation, but I think the best thing we can do is be mindful of the context and the positionality and how that shapes the data that we're able to collect.